Today I'm in the company of Guido Bonsaver, professor of Italian cultural history at Oxford University and fellow of Pembroke College. Dr. Bonsaver worked on censorship during the fascist regime, on immigration in contemporary Italian cinema, and on the influence of US culture in post-unification Italy. So welcome, Guido, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Luca.
So today we'll focus on your most recent research project dealing with the cultural interactions between Italian and American culture, an exchange which you observe from the equidistant point of view of British culture and scholarship. Along the lines of your work, we'll follow the unpredictable ways in which the reciprocal encounter of American and Italian culture unfolded through history from the 18th century to the present. So let me start. The Italian presence in the United States dates back to the early years of the new nation. The Italian diplomat, spy, tutor, weapon merchant, and journalist Filippo Mazzei was involved in the Revolutionary War and was highly regarded by Jefferson, who allegedly borrowed from him the expression, all men are created equal. Also, the Italian librettist Lorenzo da Ponte, who wrote for Mozart The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Women Are Like That, emigrated to the US in the early 19th century and founded in New York City the first department of Italian studies at Columbia University. Can you think of other notable Italians in the US in this early period?
There are a number of Italians who came to the USA, particularly during the mid-19th century, at the time of Italy's independence wars and the Civil War in the USA. I can think of Luigi Palma di Cesnola, who was an army officer in Italy, came from Turin, and came over and actually became an officer in the Union Army during the Civil War, and then moved on, and thanks to his interest in archaeology, he became the first director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Then another notable person of that period is Antonio Meucci, the inventor. He came from Florence, and he's widely recognized as the inventor of the telephone, although his patent, because of the technicality, wasn't recognized. Hence, Graham Bell got there a few years later. And Meucci is also remembered because he had a candle wax factory in Staten Island, and he gave a job to somebody called Giuseppe Garibaldi, the great Italian hero who came to New York in 1850. Again, as an exile following the independence wars in Italy. And again, related to the independence wars, there's Costantino Brumidi, who came from Rome and moved. He was a painter, came after Mazzini's Roman Republic fell in 1849. And in America, Brumidi is mainly remembered as the painter of various frescoes inside the Capitol building in Washington, D.C.
So in the meantime, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, also a number of American humanists, philanthropists, collectors, and industrialists started to travel to Italy for various reasons. Among them, Henry James, Isabella Gardner Stewart, Harry Widener, J.P. Morgan. So why did Americans get interested in Italy? What were they looking for? And was the American Grand Tour different?
Well, to a great extent, the interest that let's call it the American educated elite had for Italy in those years comes from a similar interest shared by the educated elite of Great Britain. And there were two aspects which attracted them to Italy. First, the classical heritage. Learning Latin and classical history and philosophy was actually part of the expected culture of a member of the establishment. Hence, a trip to Italy was always considered to be important, particularly during the formative years of a young person. And the second aspect was related to the veneration of the Italian Renaissance, both for its political heritage. After all, let's remember that in those years, Italy had some powerful regional states, some of which were republics, such as the Republic of Florence and Venice, but also because of Italy's primacy in the arts and literature during the Renaissance. And interestingly enough, a few days ago, I was talking to a colleague of mine, an historian who works particularly on civil rights movements in the USA. And he was working on the early educated elite from the black community in the USA. And he was telling me that he was intrigued by how interested they too were in studying the Italian Renaissance art, Renaissance architecture. So it was very widespread.
So in the meantime, toward the end of the 19th century, Italians started to mass migrate to America, and two narrations of Italy are established. Like one, which is the elite humanistic narration of a utopian country, which we discussed, and the other, a cynical, often racist narration of a country in political disarray. A particular episode really sparked this racist hatred when 13 Sicilians were lynched by the mob in New Orleans in 1891. Even recently, the New York Times dedicated a long article to this issue. What happened there, and what were the repercussions of this event on the later portrayal of Italians?
Well, indeed, towards the end of the 19th century, we see the first waves of mass migration coming from Italy to the USA. And there's a lot of resistance to it initially. And the lynching of March 1891, which we have to remember is actually the biggest lynching event in terms of number of people being killed in one single event that happened in U.S. history. So it really gives you a sense of how much the Italians in those early years were considered to be not far from, in terms of their position on the social ladder, not far from the black community. And we can all imagine what that meant, particularly in the southern states, before but also after the Civil War. So, yes, those were years in which the Italian community really had to fight its way up the social ladder. And in a way, it's a story, as you were saying, of two different narratives. On the one hand, the kind of idealized Italy of the Renaissance, of art and sophistication. And on the other side, the Italy, which in the 19th century was, the equivalent of a third world country, very poor education, in a very poor economic state, and hence having to export millions of workers who would simply move to the USA, to Australia, to other parts of Europe in order to find a future.
So given this context, when and how did Italian literature penetrate the American imagination? And on a lower level, the level of popular culture, how did Italian cultural icons, one of the most classic examples is pizza, how did they enter the American market?
Well, as far as literature is concerned, to some extent it goes back to what I was saying before about the prestige of, if like, Italian late medieval and Renaissance literature. So the great names, the usual suspects, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, were already considered to be, if you like, some of the peaks of European culture, and therefore, in a way, their prestige crosses the Atlantic, and there's no doubt about that. It's the different story when it comes to contemporary Italy, contemporary Italian literature, i.e. 19th and 20th century literature. It took much longer for contemporary Italian literature to kind of reach the USA. Then, if you then move to, let's call it material culture, you mentioned pizza. The journey of pizza is a very interesting one, actually. And it kind of follows the journey of migrants, because pizza arrived from Naples in the very early 20th century. I think 1905 was the year in which the first patent, the first license for selling pizzas was submitted in New York. And then it's an interesting story because pizza kind of becomes more and more integrated in the American way of life, to the point that by the time we come to the famous Chicago, the deep dish pizza, at that point there's a sense that Americans begin to kind of own the pizza. And indeed, that's what happens when we move on to mass production with big companies such as Pizza Hut and Domino's that still exist today. Those companies actually grew out outside the Italian community. So there's a sense that there was an Americanization of pizza, and then the American industry, if you like, delivered pizzas all around the world.
And conversely, when did America penetrate the Italian imagination? So how did American companies and Taylorism, especially in the early 20th century, impact Italy's industrial revolution? And when did American culture really enter Italian society?
It's very interesting that you should mention Taylorism, because I think you're absolutely right. There's a specific connection with mass production, which obviously the result of Taylorism, because it was in some particular industries that were newly born, very attached to, if you like, technological advancement. And I'm thinking in particular of the car industry and the film industry, both born in the very early years of the 20th century. And it's interesting looking at the cultural influence of the USA on Italy, that those were the areas in which people within those businesses immediately perceived that America was going to become, the biggest player in the field.
So in the same period, like say from the Spanish-American War to the spreading of Wilsonism during World War I, how did Italians view American democracy?
Well, a popular admiration towards America, in a way, continued during the early years of the 20th century and during the fascist period too. This idea of America as land of freedom and of economic and social opportunities was very much confirmed, after all, by the millions of migrants who moved there and then corresponded with Italians. Many of them actually returned to Italy. And this remained alive in fascist years, even if, because of the fascist nationalistic policies, they tried to some extent to bring emigration to a halt, simply because from a nationalistic point of view, it was kind of embarrassing to be a country that constantly exported labor simply because it didn't have enough work to offer within its borders. But also another interesting aspect is that in the eyes of fascists, and I'm thinking of Mussolini too, American democracy was always considered to be something slightly different from the so-called old democracies, i.e. France and Britain. France and Britain were always criticized as corrupted and in a way old-fashioned, whereas US culture was, and therefore politics as well, was associated with issues such as the cult of youth, dynamism, and a certain nationalistic fervor, which the fascists saw, very much kind of empathized with. And Mussolini came to the point of even likening his own economic policies to President Roosevelt's New Deal in the USA.
So how did the USA instead saw the fascist regime, and how did it change throughout the 20 years of the regime?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Or better, it shows, or it makes me say that in the early years of Mussolini's regime, we have to say that the establishment in the USA, as much as in Britain, was very much in favor of simply fascism as an answer to the threat of a socialist revolution. And therefore Mussolini was, and we just have to, all we have to do even today, we can just double check on the number of front page or actually cover image that the time dedicated to Mussolini, to see how much he was presented as a great leader. Then the tide changed around the invasion of Ethiopia in the mid-1930s, when Italy's, or better, Mussolini's aggressive foreign policy began to show, and the progressive alliance with Hitler then made it clear that at that point Mussolini was no longer that sort of savior of Italy, but simply a right-wing dictator that had to be stopped.
So if we go to the post-war years, one question that comes to mind is really what made the U.S. appealing in Italy. We have to remember that Americans were first enemies of Italians and then an allied nation. So how did an enemy become palatable to Italians, and why did Americans invest not just in the Marshall Plan but also in cultural diplomacy, and how did this relationship evolve between Italy and the United States in the years following World War II?
Well, as I was saying before, admiration for the USA actually never stopped during the fascist years. Certainly, among, if you like, the majority of the population, which let's accept it, it was still semi-literate with very low levels of education. Amongst that majority of people, America still meant the land of plenty, a place where there were real chances to have a good life. And that didn't really change. And so by the end of the war, to some extent, when the American army arrived in Italy with the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, in many ways they were accepted or actually welcome as an army of liberation, because it was bringing back democracy to Italy and fighting against fascism, and by that time what Nazism was doing, particularly after 1943, when Italy became, after all, simply a kind of a puppet state in the hands of the Nazis. So it was a very strong, positive feeling towards America, which I know sounds contradictory because, as you're saying, they were the kind of enemy nation up until 1943. But I think in the heart of Italians, America had never been the kind of enemy that the fascists wanted Italians to believe.
One last, or you wanted to add something?
No, but you mentioned the Marshall Plan, and certainly once the American army arrived and the ERC program, i.e. the Marshall Plan, began to kick in, there's no doubt that Italians bought very heavily into, if you like, the kind of lifestyle that America represented. And there's no doubt that I think the American influence was part of a process of, perhaps we can call, of secularization of Italian society that carried on from the 1950s all the way into the 70s, despite the opposition of the Catholic Church, despite the opposition of some of the major parties in government, and simply a movement towards a more liberal, more emancipated society.
Thank you. And one quick last question. Since I mentioned your project of research on Italian and American interactions, which comes out of a conference that you and your research team organized in Oxford a few years ago in 2016. I just wanted to ask, how do you see this relationship unfolding from the perspective of Great Britain, and why someone in the UK is interesting as a third party in this relationship between two other nations?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to confess that I'm a kind of suspicious third party, since I was born in Italy, so therefore my roots are very much Italian. But in a way, the simple reason why I decided to work on this project is because I'm particularly interested in cultural change, in the way in which societies absorb other cultures and develop their own one. And when it comes to the 20th century, I simply ask this question: what is the biggest cultural change that Italy went through in the 20th century? And my answer was, well, what we call the Americanization of Italian society, the influence of the USA, which very much replaced France, which was, if you like, the beacon, very influential beacon as far as Italians were concerned up until the end of the 19th century, and plays such a massive role. And so I thought, yes, if there's something I want to do, then it should be about the influence of the USA on Italy.
Thank you. And this is also a nice way to challenge assumptions and observe them from a different perspective and make them new again and find some threads for new research, new conversation, and new elaboration of thought, which might be valuable also for other context. Well, thank you very much for this very, very interesting conversation. And we talked about the relationship between Italy and the US from the Revolutionary War to the 19th century, and then getting into the 20th century with the process of that you talked about of Americanization of Italian society, and also in a certain way of Italianization of American society as well. You can find all the other episodes of the podcast on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, and at the official page at www.italianinnovators.com. And don't forget to follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter at Luca Cottini or ITA Innovators. Thank you, Guido, for the very interesting conversation today. And it was a pleasure having you in this episode.
My pleasure, Luca. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for listening, and arrivederci e alla prossima.